The real reason we are here together is to chat with Jesse Stommel. Jesse is co-founder of Hybrid Pedagogy and the Digital Pedagogy Lab. He's been teaching in higher education and ungrading since 2001, and you can follow Jesse on Twitter at Jessifer. We are honored and thrilled to welcome Jesse Stommel to our fireside chat, and with that, I'll turn it over to Jesse. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's good to see you all. It's good to be with you today. I'm really excited. I'm really excited for this conversation. Can you all hear me all right?
Yep.
Cool. I'm excited for the conversation today. I also am super glad that I got to hear the tail end of the conversation that was happening as I walked in, because it already informed a sort of different place that I wanted to kick off this conversation. And the one thing I want to say, this is called a fireside chat. Ultimately, part of that is because, yes, this can be an opportunity for you to ask me questions. But what I really hope is that we also talk about some of the successes, some of the challenges that you're facing. And obviously, I'm here to help. But I think it's also useful for us to talk as a group and for you to get help from your colleagues and for me to kind of see some of the specific things that are going on for all of you in your context. I was thinking about the comments that were made just as I was coming in, this idea that so many of us grow up in systems where we're graded, and we grow up in systems where grades are in some ways key information that we get about our learning, about how other people are perceiving our learning, about our progress. They also deeply, deeply affect our futures in certain ways. And so one of the things that happens when you start to remove that, even if you only remove it partially, it takes away this key bit of information that we're getting. And I would argue, and if you've seen, if you came to the pop-up or if you've read my work, I would argue that grades are not particularly great information. They don't communicate what we want them to communicate. They don't communicate as clearly as we want them. And they certainly don't communicate, in my view, in any kind of objective way or a way that's free from bias. I'm thinking about a quote from my brother. So my brother is a social worker, and he also does some public speaking, and he does some public speaking around issues of leadership at social work organizations. And he has this line that he says in his talks where he says, "You cannot not communicate." And I'm going to just throw that in the chat just so that you can parse that, because there's a double negative in there. The idea that you cannot not communicate. So ultimately, even the taking of grades away is communicating to something to students. Or in that gap, what are you communicating and how are you communicating? And interestingly, one of the things that I found when I first started doing ungrading was that students were trying to sort of read the tea leaves of my responses for some sort of implicit grade. So even if I wasn't grading anymore, they would be sort of listening to specific words I was using. And I could tell, and sometimes they would express to me directly, "Oh, does that word mean an A? Splendid or awesome or needs improvement. Well, does needs improvement mean a C?" So they were trying to translate the words I was using, even my facial expressions, even my reactions, even when students were doing a museum where they were sharing each of their works with one another, they would be trying to read like how long I spent at each table as some sort of way of conveying information about their progress, their learning, or even their grade, or whether I agreed with the grade that they were going to give themselves. So I think that bit that you cannot not communicate is really important, to realize that everything that we do, every interaction we have, every facial expression, every way that we communicate is part of a relationship that we're building with students. And that because students are so tuned to that grading culture, we need to make sure that we're attentive to the fact that they might continue to kind of read the tea leaves of our interactions, but also I think ways of breaking that down for students, recognizing that happens, acknowledging that verbally that happens, trying to decompress from that, which partly might mean getting students talking about grades. It's one of the reasons why I say you can't just remove grades without actually talking to students about how grades work as a system. And so what I wanted to do today was start with a quote from Star Sackstein. I know some of you may have read this chapter in preparation for today, but it connects directly to this issue. And then just to see what folks' reaction is to this. She writes, this is just literally the first 3 sentences, which I think are brilliant. She writes, language matters. It's that simple. And I love that in a sentence about language, her writing is so precise. The words she chooses are so precise. Language matters. It's that simple, period. What we say and how we say it has a big impact on how students and other stakeholders respond to our choices. Even the tone of our voices conveys meaning around our diction that can have subtle but significant ramifications. And I sort of see two, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. I see two things happening there. She's talking about the ways that we communicate about student success, student learning, but she's also talking about how you cannot not communicate your pedagogical approaches to students. So if you're not talking to students directly about the choices you're making and why you're making them, you are nevertheless communicating things about your choices. And so ultimately, I would argue, let's just be as clear as possible and let's just talk directly to students. I wonder if other people have had experiences with that, or if you have reactions to that quote from Star, or anything that folks want to jump in with. Yeah.
Yeah, I just put a comment in. I taught the same students last year in grade 7 as I teach this year in grade 8, but this year I'm giving no marks at all. But I find they're still in the habit of counting things. Like they'll count check marks and figure out exactly what word got the check mark and what sentence got the check mark, or if there's a smiley face, or if I said excellent, or like there's some of them are so programmed to count that it seems like it's going to take some time to unpack, because they're looking for meaning even where there may not be a lot of depth of meaning, but they're trying to read between lines that aren't there. And instead of just kind of taking the paragraphs that I'm writing, they're looking for other clues so they can end up with a number.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Other people have similar experiences. Alex.
I think something that comes to mind is when you just kind of say the phrase, "Oh, you're so smart." Like it's not very specific. You're not really telling them what you value as like intelligence, and what your interpretation of that could be completely different than what someone else's. And then when someone shows you something and you don't say, "Oh, you're so smart," you're by not saying something, you're communicating that you don't value what they did just as much as the next kid.
Yeah, there's a really interesting comment. And Blair, if you want to step in and elaborate on this, it's interesting, this idea that even your body language becomes a way that you're communicating. Just the way that you're standing might influence that. But I think there's another thing implicit there is, are you present when the feedback is given? If it's written on a piece of paper and you're not present, it communicates very differently. Do you have anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, that it just came to mind. Yeah, like what's my energy like when I'm with the students? The other thing is, and I haven't figured out a way yet, I teach grade 7 and I find I love when they ask questions, of course, but I have to have a system where when I'm sitting, let's say it's the U-shaped table and I'm sitting and I want to create like, I don't want to have that power imbalance. So I want to be at the same level as them, as my students. And I want it to be like an interruption free time so that we can really kind of have that chat. It's like, how do I build that into my classroom management strategies as well? So those were just some reflections I was thinking about as I read that sentence.
Yeah. There's so my brother adds something to "you cannot not communicate," and he adds the phrase "you cannot not influence relationship." And so the degree to which feedback really depends upon that relationship, and that relationship building is pedagogical. And so it means that every choice we make about like where we sit when we're giving the feedback, I love that, influences not only how the feedback is taken, but it also influences the relationships we have with those people. And that then affects the feedback. Ultimately, I would argue that we take feedback, and we take really direct feedback much better when there's a mutual relationship of trust. So starting from a place of building that relationship of trust is even in some ways more important than giving the feedback, because the feedback isn't necessarily even effective unless we've put the energy towards that. Other thoughts? Jamie.
Really loud out there.
Yeah, the passages make me think about how I approach pedagogy with my students as well, in that I've started over the past few years just explaining in explicit detail why, as the teacher, I'm making the choices I make in the classroom directly to the students. So I'll explain why I get them to work in groups. I'll explain why I give a type of assignment that I give. I ask for their feedback. We have an actual like in-depth conversation about all the teacher moves that I make. And I've found over my time doing that, the buy-in from the students is so much better. And I haven't yet had the grading conversation with them, but I imagine I would approach it the same way. And I imagine I'd feel the same results from the classes.
Yeah. Rebecca and then Sherry.
Thinking about language and how we're talking to students, this year I'm working a lot with student success on a student success side, where I'm helping a lot of struggling students. And one of the things that I've been asking them is, tell me in your own words what's going on and how this course is going for you. And I've been finding that just by asking that question, they just open up and they start explaining all kinds of things, and it just gives me those entry points to start deconstructing that and working with them.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, I mean, that really brings me back to the thing I started with, is that in the void where you're removing grades, you got to put something else in that void. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to put a lot of yourself in that void. It might be what you're talking about, which is invitations for students to fill that void with their own voices. Because there's one anxiety around ungrading is, oh gosh, if I don't grade, then I'm going to have to spend so much more time giving feedback, for example. And I don't think necessarily, I mean, just imagine there's that void, that communication void. What else can you fill it with? Their own voices, their communication with one another, et cetera. Sherry and then Greg.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, I didn't know I had to talk, but I guess I will. So I just find that in the classroom, like it's we're doing retesting a lot, and I know it's still testing, but it's kind of like I'm telling them all the time, like it doesn't matter how poorly they do on something, let's say, it's just really cool that they get to learn, and their journey of learning is way more important than how they actually performed at that one day, that one moment. And that we're just kind of watching them throughout the semester. And so just kind of like, yeah, that's cool. You don't know that. You did that poorly in the test. Oh, how can we teach you that? That's really awesome. So it's just switching your angle towards like how exciting it is to learn. And it doesn't matter where you're at in the non-judgmental atmosphere of the classroom.
Yeah. Well, and Peter Elbow writes about, and I quoted from this at the pop-up, I think, in his piece about ranking, evaluating, and liking, separating out three forms of judgment. He talks about, we want to reduce the amount of ranking that we're doing, continue to do evaluation, but then he introduces this idea of liking, which I think resonates with what you're talking about, just feeling awe at our students' work. But it's fascinating that we actually have to talk about doing that. Otherwise, this thing happens, that our awe, if we show awe to one student, but then don't at another moment, like genuine emotions come as we have them. We can't necessarily always modulate them really carefully or pedagogically. If we allow ourselves to experience awe or excitement, we have to recognize that students are in a place where they're having to translate, where they feel like they have to translate that into a mark. And so talking to students and just making that plain, saying, I recognize this might happen. But I think it's really important that we just sit with each other's work, that we just enjoy each other's work, and that we don't always evaluate it. Yes, evaluation plays a role, but sometimes we just want to sit with each other's work. Greg.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Sorry.
Yes, you're kind of echoing 1,000 times.
Sorry about that. So what I wanted to say is, I sort of, an addition to the point that you were making is that with this feedback, however, I think each student, you sort of develop a lexicon, with that kid, like with each individual student. Like if I walk through and I look at some results and I say, okay, well, that's great, to one kid, and I say, to that kid, that might mean, okay, well, I'm sort of on track. And if I say that's great to another kid, it means something completely different. And so I think that that's an adjustment that we have to make through this process as well, understanding that it's not just, my personal meaning of the word, it's their interpretation of that word could mean different things as well.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, one of the things that I often hear from folks is this notion that students are demanding or obsessed with or need marks or feel like they need marks. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize and take responsibility for is the fact that we're kind of in some ways the guardians for the educational system that has put them in that position. Students aren't born into the world expecting marks or translating every word that we say into a mark. So we have to kind of own and take responsibility that this is not them. It's in some ways, it's a systemic thing that we have to address. And that doesn't mean just changing what's happening for them. It also means if we're going to change what happens in our classroom, the relationships we have with students in our classroom, we also have to work on changing the system at the institution as a whole, which doesn't mean snapping our fingers and having marks be gone, but it means having critical conversations with our colleagues, with our administrators, advocating for students in those conversations. Other thoughts? Other people want to jump in? You can hear Hazel in the background. She's she's doing what Hazels do. She's 4.5, and I can actually already see that shift starting to happen where she's in preschool. And it's not there yet, but we're right on the cusp where she's going to start internalizing the system of assessment that we have in education, because there's expectations for a preschooler by the time they go to kindergarten, and you're already starting to hear language around that. So this is not just, if you're teaching high school, for example, we're talking about 10 to 12 years of culture that students have been embedded in for much of their school life. So I am happy to go to talk about the readings. We can just jump into anything else that resonated with you in Star's piece or questions that came up for you. And I'm also happy to talk about my own piece and stuff that were raised there. This conversation is meant in many ways for you. So your own reflections, talking about your own successes and your own challenges. But I really want you to drive the conversation. So I would say, let's just open it up to stuff that's coming up for you as you're doing these readings, as you're finding ways to reconcile it with your own practice. And truthfully, I would say no specific thing that you're facing in your classroom I feel like it will resonate and be useful for other folks to hear us working through some of that. So if you have some really specific situation that you're working through, feel free to bring it into the conversation. Sahar.
Oh, hi. So I have a question. Ooh, sorry.
Maybe we'll come back to Sahar when the audio. Greg, in the meantime, Greg. You're muted.
There you go. Nope.
Can you hear me all right now?
Yep.
Okay. So sort of jumping into the belly of the beast. I mean, reading this, my immediate reaction is how am I going to have these conversations with my math teachers? And from their perspective, going to non-grading, I feel like that's going to be a very good, challenge for them for certain. But I don't feel like I have the tools to be able to present to them why I think this is necessary across the board and not just in the sciences where I'm at, for example.
Yeah. Do other people want to elaborate on that or have similar things that you're thinking about? I love math teachers. And I know Jamie meant that as a joke, but let's just say that we love math teachers. But interestingly, there are some different disciplinary distinctions that are worth making. Do other folks want to jump in on that, or are math teachers that specifically want to jump in? Amy.
Yeah, hi. So I am teaching math, but it's grade 7 and 8, so I imagine that's a little bit different. I teach math and science. And I definitely I can see how it works because if you're evaluating a concept or not evaluating, I know that's not exactly what we're trying to do still, but if you're looking at a concept, you can kind of tell looking at students' work or just through your conversations, do they get this concept or they don't get that concept. But I think I'm in a similar boat where I'm just starting this journey myself, and other than having the conversation with the students, I guess I'm not sure where to start. I guess.
I put in the chat, I put a piece by a short book by John Holt called How Children Fail. And I may have brought this up at the pop-up, I can't remember, but it's the first pedagogy book I ever read. And it's about his experience teaching elementary math education. And it's just a fascinating book. He did not go on to continue being a math teacher for at least in the public school system for the majority of his career, but this is really just about his first years of encountering being an elementary math teacher. And it's sort of fascinating how much I learned from that. And in some ways it was seeing his talking about teaching the subject of math with an ungrading approach, with a play-based education approach, with an experimental, practice-based approach that really drove a lot of my thinking and my pedagogy. And I think in some ways, the friction between disciplines or the conversations across disciplines ends up being some of the most fruitful work. So to go back to Greg's question, I would think leading with the fact that those are the conversations that are most going to push you in your thinking about grades and assessment. I think that helps kind of draw us together, is to say, we actually need these cross-disciplinary conversations, and we need disciplines to work in slightly different ways and classes to work in slightly different ways. And then if I think about specific practices that I've seen work in math education or science education, things like collaborative exam taking, or things that take essentially maybe not removing the grades, but recognizing that the class is a collaborative community and that it isn't about ranking each student's individual math aptitude, but it's about creating a system of assessment that is built around what can the students do together and how can they help one another grow. And so then you suddenly are open to, why would I need to assess an individual human being's math aptitude? Why don't I assess their ability to collaborate around the subject of math? And maybe that's where we anchor the assessment. Other thoughts? Other people want to jump in? Sahar.
All right, take 2 on this.
All right. Hi, Jesse. I just have a question.
Yeah.
I was curious of how your experience has been or was in your school. Were you the only person that started doing this on your own? And then how did you have others join or not? And the other question is, how was the system, the institution, treating you as a teacher and your students?
So I'd love other folks to jump in here as well. I have been doing this practice for since 2001. So that would be, 20 years. And when I first started doing it, I was really the only person that I knew who was grading in this approach, except for one mentor that I had. And honestly, that one mentor was really important to me because in some ways, he did not say, Jesse, you have my permission to do this. But working with him as a mentor felt like it emboldened me and gave me permission. And at first, I remember, so I was teaching writing at the time. And I remember what I did is I had students self-evaluating, and they would give themselves a grade on each paper that they wrote. And then what I did was I read their self-evaluation, and I took the grade that they gave themselves and I put it onto their paper, on the top of their paper, along with my feedback. or on the bottom of their paper. I can't remember what I put it, but I remember that act of transferring their grade was a kind of me confirming that it was indeed the grade that they had gotten. I remember feeling really troubled by that and thinking, this is a very strange thing to be doing. I never did that again, because I recognized that ultimately it was like my ability to confirm, like my power, my role in the relationship was as the confirmer of what they knew about themselves and their own work, and that actually undermined the work. So, and I would say that at the time that I was doing that, I didn't know anyone else who was using the same approach. I did have mentors I could talk to about it. I did pretty quickly have maybe one other teacher who I was a really close collaborator with, who was also ungrading. And so we got to talk through our approach. But I will also say that it's not that I kept it secret, but I didn't necessarily talk about my approach. I thought I structured it as a relationship that I had with students, not necessarily with my colleagues. And that was partly out of fear. Was I even allowed to do this? Yes, I thought I was allowed to do it, but I was also worried about someone telling me no and how I would respond to that, or the argument that would be created. There was a huge hierarchy in my first position where I felt precarious. And so I didn't talk about it for many years. And I would say, though, that talking about it and sort of being more honest and assertive about my practice has really helped my practice grow. And so I feel like in some ways I did a lot of really good work having conversations with students in those early years, but it has been more recently in the last 6 to 10 years that I've really pushed myself to investigate, interrogate my own practice, because I've been more direct about it and talking to other colleagues about it. And so I've learned how to do that, but it took quite a while. Does that answer your question? Anything else? Anybody else have questions about that and want a little bit more? I mean, the one thing that I'll say is that having worked precariously, and I will say that the work of teaching is precarious, no matter what our job title is, no matter what institution we're at, no matter what union protections we have, increasingly the work of teaching is precarious and feels precarious. And I don't think teachers get the level of support that they need to do any of their work. And so I think finding ways to come together as colleagues and support each other. And I think one of the keys in doing that is to recognize that it's not just that all of our teaching will look different because we're different people working with different humans in different contexts. There's Hazel, she's making a guest appearance. But it's also about the fact that we wouldn't want all of our teaching to look the same. So sort of leading with, I want to have a conversation with you, my colleagues, about this, because I really love that each of our students have a different experience at each of our classes. And I want to talk through about why we're doing this. I think that also helps the disciplinary conversation, because it isn't that I want other people teaching in other disciplines to do exactly what I do, but that I actually want us to have space to each do things a little bit differently, but to just accept at the start that pushing on our own practice is crucial to the work that we do. Other thoughts? Other folks want to jump in with questions or continuations on this line of thought? Jamie.
Just listening to people as they're talking and reading the comments, I have in my head an image of like dominoes falling, and if grades is a domino, and as we start pushing on it and asking questions about it, why do we grade? What's it for? And that domino starts to fall. What other dominoes does it land on? Right? It pushes on assessment. It pushes into equity and access. And I can imagine why the idea of ungrading makes people uncomfortable, because they have to start asking other questions about their practice and interrogating within themselves and within the system why they do the things they do and why they value the things they value. And so I think a big part, I think a big part of this is being okay with sitting in that discomfort and really reflecting on the practice you have and the practice you want to have. That's the things I'm taking away right now.
Yeah. Ian.
Yeah, you said it shouldn't take a lot more time to ungrade, but to me, this year anyway, it feels like it does. It's a lot easier to slap on a B+ and move on than it is to kind of, you're forced to read more slowly and to interact more purposefully with students,
Deeply.
keeping in mind where they're coming from. I have small classes this year, so it's manageable, but if I had classes that were 30 kids, I wouldn't know where to begin to have this happen. So that's kind of one piece, wondering what you think about that. But the other piece is I'm a French teacher, and very often kids have no idea how they're doing because their understanding of French is this tiny little corner of a very complex language. So I'm not sure how to elicit their feedback. And how do you feel like you're doing French? I'm doing great. You know what? You really don't know much French at all. So they know within their little tiny parameter, but they don't know how much else is out there. So how do we elicit feedback from kids that's meaningful when in fact they don't really know a greater context beyond their own limited experience?
Well, so I mean, the thing that I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about what I said about making sure that we're not imagining that we have to fill the gap only with our own voice, because in some ways, feedback can be just as dangerous isn't the right word, deleterious. It can be just as negative. It can have just as much of a negative impact as grades if it's focused on too directly, because then students just become used to sort of seeing themselves only reflected in the words that we say about their work. And if you read, Alfie Cohen has a book called Punished by Rewards, which I know gets quoted a number of times in the Ungrading book. And Punished by Rewards is not just about quantitative rewards. It's not just the way that collecting A's or collecting points has a negative impact on learning, but it's the same way that feedback, giving students constant affirmation, can also be negative. And so ultimately, what I think we want students to be able to do is sit inside of an open question about their own learning. And what would that look like in your class? Well, I can imagine that it might look like, instead of asking students just, how much are you learning? Maybe asking students to have a conversation about their learning, maybe in French, with their fellow students. And so that then what they would end up doing is hearing how their other students are reflecting on their own learning. So in some ways, bringing students together into the work. Because I think that, already self-evaluation and self-reflection is extraordinarily hard work. In your discipline, I think it's even harder, because so much of the work of learning a language, and I'm terrible at learning languages, so I could speak to this from experience. So much of the learning of a language is tacit, little small things that you don't even realize you're doing or learning. And it's really hard, especially at those early stages of the language, to recognize when you have crested, a big boundary. Sure, I can tell you how many vocabulary I've learned in the last year, but that actually isn't the heart of learning a language, even at those early stages. So I guess I would say trying to get students talking to one another and doing that work collectively, so that you don't feel like you're the arbiter of their learning. Other folks. And then I guess I want to answer the question about, more than 30 students. And I think that the key is to think about if we think about what is our relationship to our students, this goes back to that relationship building. When you're working with a group of 30 students, or even when you're working with a group of 15 or working with a group of 150, I think we need to realize that we're not building 30 one-to-one relationships. When I have 30 students, I'm not building 30 relationships of me to that student, me to another student. Once we get to 150 students, we don't have 150 productive one-to-one relationships. If you think about how many friends or family members you actually have a productive relationship within your life, I don't know, even people extraordinarily good at it probably max out at around 50 or 60 relationships they're able to maintain. So trying to maintain a relationship with 120, 150 kids across multiple classes, I think is too much to reasonably expect of ourselves, especially if some of us are introverts. I think I productively maintain 12 relationships as an introvert, those one-on-one relationships. So instead, if we think about what we are is a community builder, what we're trying to do is foster lots of successful one-to-one relationships within our class, but they're not one-to-one with us. They're one-to-one with each other. And so then that changes what our role is. So if we're not trying to build those one-to-one relationships, we don't have to communicate directly to every single student. What we have to do is model how students communicate with one another. And same thing with giving feedback. We don't have to give feedback in every circumstance. It'd be good if all the students at least have a touch point with us at least once or a few times throughout a term, but you don't have to give every student's feedback on every single thing. Instead, thinking about how do I model feedback giving so that students can be giving each other productive feedback and giving themselves feedback in the gap of not receiving feedback from us, so that they're not just waiting to hear what we think. They're able to actually say, oh, I'm not going to get feedback on every single thing. It's my responsibility to think through this, but I have help from my teacher in doing that. Does that also hopefully help with the, and just to be really mechanical, what that might look like in a class is instead of writing feedback letters to every student, you might write a feedback letter to the entire class where you talk about the entire class's work. And then you maybe pull out 3 or 4 different examples, and then students get to see the kinds of things you're noticing and what, how that works. Instead of saying to every student, it's great when you do X, you can say in a letter to the class, I'm noticing this, and I'm noticing how much students are learning when they're doing X, Y, Z. And that way every student has the benefit of that feedback. I think it's very weird that we write feedback, I write feedback to Blair, and then Rebecca never sees that feedback. And so all of that work that I put towards Blair would be useful for Rebecca. And we don't find a way to actually put that into action. Franna.
All right, so I just wanted to comment just about that whole authentic, students knowing who they are and where they're at and being able to give that really honest feedback about themselves and their own achievement. And so I teach kind of like a bit of everything. So I have music and English and ESL and student success and all kind of a little bit of all of the things. And in music, I find that I learned with my vocal kids, feedback coming from each other is really, really also very super authentic, but they're terrified. So, because I don't know, maybe it's the nature of the beast is vocals, get up in front of and sing in front of people, that's terrifying. So, what I have them do is anonymous feedback on these little grids. And then I cut them out and put them in these little booklets and give them back to them. And so I can screen them to make sure that they're not, they're actually good. And I do a whole lesson about what does good feedback look like. So don't just say, oh, it sucked. If you have something that you need to sort of build on, then you try to pick a couple things that they need to kind of work on, and then one thing that you really need to work on, a couple things they really, really loved. And so that's kind of the goal. And giving them a lot of vocabulary, giving them a lot of I do a lot of examples of famous people, and then it's okay, so this person, let's give this person some feedback about their breath support and their feeling and their blah, 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 and all that sort of stuff, right? And then we unpack that and say, okay, so then when they're looking at their own performances, well, I have the same issues as that super famous person, right? So yeah, and just to speak to Greg, who's right beside me, I would say that I never actually would say so Rebecca did this really well, but Laura didn't. I just picked those 2 people because I know them. But I would say something so there was a lot of you who really excelled at this part. And then this part, maybe we all kind of need to work on that. So let's implement XYZ activity to kind of try and work on that. So I think we're all doing that. But I just found with music, it just lent itself really authentically to showing what a good example is, either myself or a famous person, unpacking that, throwing myself under the bus a little bit, and then giving them the sort of freedom to anonymously shout out each other and make really great comments. And then they love having those little booklets. They're literally this big, and they're stapled together, and it says, you were amazing at this. you're really great at that, you know, and they really awesome stuff and they build it. Anyway, that's just a lot of words, but that's, I thought, and then they kind of know where they're struggling and then they know what they've done well. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because I'm thinking about the issue of praise and how, you know, ultimately punished by reward. Too much praise, if it's not used productively, can be negative. However, one of the things I hear you describing is when you, and this is an anonymized you, which I like, that kind of addresses Greg's comment in the chat around what about privacy issues? Well, it isn't, we're not really talking about individual students. And at the point that you've worked with hundreds of students, it's possible for you to talk about what I've noticed over my career is these kinds of things. What I noticed over reading 150 self-evaluations were some of these things. So it's possible to do it in an anonymized way. And then it's also possible with our praise to not just say, wow, you're great, but to say, when you do X, it has this impact on me. So if you did more of X, that would produce more of that effect. And so it's, instead of saying you are doing X, Y, Z wrong, saying this really hit me. And getting students to be able to sit in that and actually, rather than just receive praise, being able to kind of critically evaluate the moments that really work for them. The other thing that I'm thinking about is shoot, I lost it. Other folks want to jump in. Franna, do you want to jump in again, or is that your legacy hand? Okay. Matthew.
So I mean, Jen Smallwood's on the call somewhere in one of these tiny little boxes. We were having a conversation the other day about the ungrading practice, the amazing ungrading practice she's doing in her class, and we had great discussions about, you know, teaching and modeling students how to seek feedback from others, and you know, like modeling, like eliciting feedback from others, and having that gradual release of control where you can empower other students to seek feedback beyond just like ask three before me, like actually like listening to each other and building on each other's learning in a productive way, and sort of decentering yourself as the sole doler outer of feedback, and sort of that I think there's a degree of like unprogramming or deprogramming or unlearning with the students that like your feedback as the teacher is the only one that matters. And I think that's one of the like barriers to peer feedback and having that feedback kind of equally dispersed throughout the class. But I love how she was talking about, like, you know, modeling how to prompt students to ask specific questions of others, and then move from that stage to not actually giving feedback at all, and having them to rely on others. And so I think there's a lot of deprogramming that needs to happen, and I think there's a lot of modeling and teaching and a slow transition within that process too.
Well, it's also, I think that's one of the reasons why I think that I get really nervous when I hear people talking about having to give more feedback to students, because that is in some ways exactly what needs to get deprogrammed. It's not that students shouldn't look to us for feedback or evaluation. They absolutely should. I think the issue is that they're already primed to look to us too much for feedback or evaluation or grades. And so finding some ways to sort of back up a little bit ourselves and allow other things to happen. One of the other things that and this relates to what Franna was saying a minute ago, one of the other things I think is important to model, so there's a lot of different things, model giving feedback and what that looks like, model asking for feedback, which Matt just talked about. And then I think also model getting feedback, because it's really hard to get feedback. And so Franna made a little remark about how she allows herself to be a subject of critique or evaluation or commentary. And I think that can be really powerful, is using yourself as an example, because then they can watch you receiving feedback and recognize the sort of humbling how humbling it is, and even making jokes about how humbling it is to receive feedback, but then also modeling how you ask questions of other people when you get feedback, as opposed to, as opposed to just repeating the feedback or accepting the feedback, but inquiring and asking more. Those kind of things are useful for students to see. So I think also along with that, model receiving feedback. And also model receiving feedback with good humor, and and that it's playful, and that it's interesting, it's curious, being curious about the kinds of feedback you get from people. The other thing I guess I would say is that we have to create space for I lost the thread on that also. Sorry. That'll come back to me. The last one did a few moments later. Laura. I got daddy brain, I guess.
Maybe I'll be able to add to that. I think the thing I was going to say was modeling the not knowing. Like I think that the language classroom is a great example. Like there's no way you'll ever know all the words or have all the strategies to speak to whatever level you are hoping to, or proficiency level you're trying to aim to. But by us classroom teachers modeling that, what is the end goal? Is the end goal just distilled down to 100%? Well, that means nothing, because I actually want to know what you don't know and what strategies you have when you don't know something. So to me, that's more valuable than, yes, checklists, you know the following curriculum expectations. It's actually where you don't know. And I think that, to me, that was in the book. I think in maybe it was in your chapter, Jesse, about encouraging the not knowing over the knowing, and how creating those spaces. That to me spoke brilliantly, because then especially for my world of FSL and ESL, and it really or for French and English as a second language, it really makes sense that the end goal is not fluent native speaker of either language, right? The end goal is to communicate, right? And so as a bilingual, as a multilingual, how are you effectively communicating, and what strategies do you use to effectively communicate, and what strategies do you need for the next situation or for whatever it is that you're trying to do? So that's I think that maybe that added on to what you were talking about in the modeling idea.
Yeah, and I'm just going to put these words here because these are words I was thinking about as you were talking about, Laura. So I talked about ranking, evaluating, and liking from that Peter Elbow article, but also why not analyzing, observing, noticing, wondering at, sitting with. So this sense in which that kind of sitting in our not knowing can even happen in our self-reflection, in our feedback, in our analysis, in our assessment practices as well. We can talk about what we're noticing in students' work, or how they're using language, or their voice when they're singing, and just observe details without necessarily having an answer to whether it's good or bad. I think we so often go towards evaluation that to me, that in some way fits in this idea of liking, that we can just talk about, when you sing, I notice these things. We can just talk about things that we're observing without necessarily having to get to the place of saying whether it's good or bad, and get students used to just noticing things about their work or about their language, as opposed to having them all the time have to know whether it was good or bad. I know that in writing, one of the things that I find is that students are much more capable of doing that at the sentence level than at the level of an entire essay. You can't, is this essay good or bad? What are your strengths or weaknesses in this essay? Don't work nearly as well as pull out a sentence that you feel like is working extraordinarily well and talk to me about why it's working. Or pull out a sentence that you think that is a moment where you were struggling, and talk about how you were struggling inside of that sentence. Because then all of a sudden it's not, I'm a terrible writer, because that's what gets associated with the success of an essay, is I'm a terrible writer. Or certainly can you sing a song from beginning to end, becomes I'm a terrible singer. But then making observations about just how your voice moves across a few notes ends up being a more productive place to sit. Yeah, and actually, yes, that's absolutely true. They get paralyzed, because the second that they get to that place of either shame or pride, maybe as well, that place of shame or pride isn't nearly as productive as a place of observation and curiosity. Other thoughts? So I want to take a moment just because we've got about 10 minutes left. And I want to use these last 10 minutes for folks to just, we can still talk about stuff that came up with you from the articles, but do folks have questions for me? Things that would be useful. In some ways, the arc of these conversations, I'm going to be back with you in a couple weeks. The arc of these conversations is that really this session is about the sort of larger the what's and how, what's and whys of this work. And then we'll move more towards the practice, the kind of nuts and bolts of specifically what are you doing in your classroom. But I'm wondering if folks want to ask more questions, but I'm going to throw it over to Sahar and then Jennifer. And don't worry if you have something about something we were previously talking about.
Yes, Jesse, I wanted to follow up on what you were saying about observing and what have you observed, and teaching students about that, because one of the things that we are also working on is emotions. And so I'm also wondering how we can make it and make it okay for us to attach emotions to learning. So when you are learning and you're observing something about writing, for example, what are the emotions that are coming up with that? When you think that your writing is quote unquote not good enough, what are the emotions attached to that? And how you can stop it and be present and make sure that you shift. Because I believe that if you don't shift your emotions, then the learning won't come with that. Yeah. So I think that needs to go parallel. So it's not a question, but maybe a comment and see how you feel about that.
Yeah, that's cool. The other thing, it's a great point. The thing that I was thinking about is the way that grades inherently have emotions associated with them. When we receive a grade, it's emotional. Giving grades is often emotional. And maybe because of that, it clouds the other emotions that we actually have to deal with around our own learning and around sitting uncomfortably with our not knowing. Like something like shame around a bad grade can really drown out the other productive emotions that we probably need to deal with in doing the work of thinking through our learning process. It also likely means that when we're grading, we're dealing with these really strong emotions of fear and anxiety and shame and pride that come with our systems of quantitative assessment and marks. And it keeps us from actually dealing with the real stuff that would get us to the heart of the work. And so absolutely, I think when I talk about the emotional register of grades, it isn't that we want to remove the emotional register. It's maybe that's too loud and it's drowning out other productive work that we have to do. Jennifer.
Kind of continuing on the idea of emotions. Mentioned before, but I teach in a self-contained gifted 7-8 class. And a lot of the students in my class, part of their identity is the fact that they're gifted and that they tend to get, especially until grade 7, we give them letter grades. So they come in and they say, I'm an A student, I'm a B student, I'm an A+ student, and they almost expect nothing different. They expect that this is the grade, and their parents often will feed into this identity, and they have a really hard time leaving the identity of the A student and kind of becoming just a learner who can appreciate the feedback. And so, an experience last week, I had a student get back a rubric from another class. They got an A-, a 4-, and they cried, ripped it up and threw it in the garbage. And I said, that's like the discussion around that. And this is, they shame each other, in our class, the gifted kids will say B is a gifted fail. They'll comment about the repercussions they're going to have at home because of, certain levels. It makes me feel like I can't give honest grades because they're so making themselves so sick. It's such a part of their identity. I don't know how to undo it. And then, when you do give a rubric back or feedback back and there's no grade, it's like they panic, right? Mm-hmm. So my question is like, in starting to kind of build a culture of trust and trusting themselves as students and trusting what they know, how do I also kind of start to have, not a conversation with parents, but start to teach the kids that they have to be a little bit more confident in their own skills and not just going home. I mean, you go home and show your parents you have an A-. How can you say, look at what I learned? Because the parents come back to us and say, where did the 10% go? They got 90. Where's the 10%? It's always what they didn't do, right? It's always a deficit language. It's never like, oh wow, look at how well they did. It's where did that last 10% go? And it's such a strong culture in the gifted program that it is really stopping a lot of our kids from just learning, because they're going for that end goal.
Yeah, to me, I would like, I almost just want to say, well, what's the point that short circuits? Like, because there's so many symptoms that you're describing that we could deal with all day. Like, what was the short circuit? And I actually heard it in your first sentence, and you probably heard it in your first sentence too, which is the students come and say, I'm an A student. And that, I think, is one of our problems, is that we try, and we do it in the language, our institutions do it in the way they talk about grades. And just culturally, it's the way that we talk about grades. Even that phrase is problematic, because this isn't who you are as a person. Who you are as a person is a complicated set of behaviors and actions and feelings, and some sense of a core identity. Who you are is not your grade. But then also, I think that we then say, okay, well, if it's not about an A student, then it's about the work. This is an A work. But then all of a sudden we get to someone's essay, and then we're trying to say that's an A essay, that's a B essay, and we usually see that falls flat. The different readers interpret things in different ways, and grade norming doesn't really become possible. So shifting it to the process, I think, is ultimately what we have to do. And what I wish you could do and what you actually can do are probably different, because I wish you could just go in and say, you're all getting A's. Don't worry about it. You're all getting A's. Let's end that right here. And let's talk about this. Let's talk about what it would look like to fail. And now you get a space where you can fail. You've never gotten to do this your life. This is going to be the hardest work you ever do. You get a space to fail, and you get to do it safely right here. And I will never tell your parents that you failed, but I mean, you probably give the same talk to their parents, and you say, this is why they need it so badly. And the truth is, if we think about human development, or how learning progresses, when someone's first learning something, failure usually isn't productive. What's productive is free play, being able to play without the expectation of an outcome. Because people already start to internalize failure. So you try and create situations where people can freely experiment without even the expectation of success. And then later, at the point that you're getting your students, what they actually need to do is to get better, is to let themselves fail. Like, if I think about a writer, a genius writer, a writer who is in the gifted class, they have probably boxed themselves into a corner for the sake of continuing to maintain that sense of self that they have that's associated with that success. What they need more than anything is a chance to say, okay, I'm gonna get to fumble, and I get to fumble next to other people. And so if there was a way to take advantage of that, I think that would be wonderful. And even if you could, and there's ways to do it. I've seen teachers come in and say, everyone starts at an A. And you can use a version of contract grading, for example, where you say the only way you're gonna get less of an A is with these discrete things that you do. And they're all associated with very clear objective. If you don't turn in all the work, if you miss more than this many classes, or whatever objective markers, and then everything else is up to you to figure out and fumble your way through. But thanks for that question. It's a super good one, and that's it. Honestly, I will say that the high performing students have been the hardest ones for me to work with over my career. That's who I end up having to put. It's really the highest performing students and the students who are struggling who are the ones that I put more of that one-on-one attention towards. And it's really about figuring out where that one-on-one attention is necessary in order to keep people with the group. Another thing that I know is an immediate problem is if I see students start comparing themselves to one another, there are so many negative symptoms associated with that I just back up and I say, whoa, let's talk about that. Why are you doing that? And how do you think that that's useful for you? And with an 8th grader, I think you could ask them those questions directly. With younger kids, you have to frame that a little bit different. But with an 8th grader, you just say, why are you comparing yourself to your fellow students? Let's talk about that. Is that helping you? How is it helping you? Alex.
I feel like we've kind of made that shift in physical education where we don't expect students to master these skills or to be a master of a skill, but we just say, okay, try, fail, learn, get feedback, like keep going at it. But for some reason in other subjects, we expect them to all become masters at these things. So I'm wondering why we've moved away from that in physical education and not in other areas within our curriculum.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and there's a huge, the idea of mastery learning is super popular right now. And I just hear that word mastery and I'm like, wow, that's really not going to help us. Because the truth is, like, at what point do you ever master something? Like at the point that you think you mastered it, that's probably the point at which you need the most help. And so like thinking about like just I think having larger but this goes back to the comment earlier that if you open up ungrading, suddenly you're having all of these conversations and you end up realizing, oh, we have to let go of the idea that education is about anyone mastering anything. If anything, it's about really rich space for practice at some kind of future mastery that hopefully gets debunked. And then the idea, then sometimes it's like, no, you master these skills and then you master these skills and then you master these skills and you just keep going and going and going. And that just feels like a Sisyphean, like just that we're just constantly rolling up a hill and you'll never get there, but you got to keep pushing every stage, which also doesn't feel productive. So we have about 1 more minute. Any last words? Well, what you guys are going to hang out together, but you've got 1 more minute with me. Any last words or questions? So you're going to have me back. I'm going to be back in, do you remember I don't actually have the date right in front of me, but it's in a couple weeks, in a few weeks. And I'm super excited and hopefully I'll get to see you all again.